Firstly, I'd like to welcome Jan and David Fullerton and Roger and Alex Miller, Holmes Miller's son and daughter. Welcome to our 23rd lecture, Sir Holmes Miller Memorial Lecture. Holmes Miller was born after the First World War, and he found himself in the Second World War. And after the war was over and he completed his studies and became the surveyor that he was, and with Sir Edmund Hillary and a number of other people, they established and put a stake in the ground at Scott Base. And Scott Base became the future home for many graduates and scientists who had the inclination to be conservationists and to look after the future of Antarctica and New Zealand. I was in Antarctica and I was fortunate to meet Sir Holmes Miller, who, by the way, his name was changed during the Second World War. It wasn't his choice, but it became Bob Miller. When I met him, he was Bob Miller. And the thing that I always remember about him was nice man, very encouraging. And on one occasion, he came through the kitchen and said to me, "Excuse me, son, how would you like to speak to your mother and father?" Now, this is 1962. And I said, "You've got to be joking." He said, "No, come with me." So we went through to the Radio Shack and he put on some earphones and he dialed some things, and then he said, "Now dial your home number." So I dialed my home number and there was my mother on the other end of the phone. Now, how exciting was that for a 17? I just turned 17, and you've got to remember that within the 5-year time frame prior to that, we were only starting to get phones in our homes and fridges. And so my memories of Sir Holmes Miller, Bob Miller, is way up there. So without ado, I'd like to ask our patron, Peter Barrett, to step forward and introduce our lecturer for the evening. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Maury. I just reflect on my time in Antarctica where I just missed meeting Bob Miller because he was in the field when we arrived and he was still in the field when we left. But he was an amazing guy. Well, I'm now going to be introducing Colin Monteath, someone that I've known and admired for since about the first met in the mid-70s. And in those days, those post-IGY days, the science was done largely by the Department of Scientific and Industrial Research, and the government provided the clothing and the gear. And especially those early mapping parties and exploration parties like Bob organised. But the universities had to provide their own clothing. They were latecomers to the party. And when Colin joined Antarctic Division in 1973 as field operations officer, he could see we were struggling a bit, but he had his own mountaineering experience and he provided better gear than we could. And he successfully made the case for all parties going into the field to have the same gear. So we're very grateful to you, Colin. Colin began a special relationship with Erebus, now a book, and the topic of this lecture in his first Antarctic field season. And I have to mention there was some good fortune when he met a university student that season who had failed his first year subjects in science, but was considered a worthy rascal by his professor and encouraged to go on in geology. And some of us in this room understand what it is like to, we didn't get quite there, but Dave and I were close. So this guy, for his PhD, led the first expedition to study Erebus as a volcano. He gathered world experts through the 1970s. He went on to lead over 40 expeditions in total. His name is, of course, Philip Kyle. He's one of our most productive and colourful alumni, but just a small part of tonight's story. Colin was a key figure in organising those early Erebus expeditions through the 1970s that allowed him to climb and photograph and support other science projects throughout the Transantarctic Mountains. And of course, he loved it. But he decided he should broaden his experience and go freelance. And as a consequence, over 30 years, he's developed a reputation as a world-class photographer, alpinist, guide, with many book projects as a result. So Colin, the Erebus book has been the greatest thus far, combining a lifetime of experience and your passion for history and your eye for striking imagery. So now we're going to hear your introduction to this book and the project. Thank you.
Well, it's a privilege to be here, and I spent an exciting day up with Peter up at the Antarctic Research Centre, celebrating its 50 years, of course, and there's more than that of Victoria University expeditions, but 50 years of their specific Antarctic Research Centre is a great milestone, and it was just wonderful to see the staff involved and having smoko and lunch and just the energy and talking about a big traverse they're doing across the Ross Ice Shelf this season for drilling underneath part of the Ross Ice Shelf. So it's fantastic. So I used to come to Wellington as part of my field operations job because there was a Ross Dependency Research Committee then, of which Bob Miller, of course, was the chairman. So my job was the meat and the sandwich between the science and the logistics, and I had to convince the science committees that what Antarctic Division in Christchurch was capable of or not capable of, because in those days the vehicle and air support that we had was very, very limited. So as Peter had said, it was a great job because it was a job in the office in Christchurch during the winters, but in the summer I could go down to Scott Base and help the leader run the base, and I had a great excuse to go out with field parties just for 3 days or 3 weeks or whatever. So in 75, I chose to join Phil Kyle, 75, 76, and then 78 when I went into the inner crater of Erebus. Yeah, fantastic job. And the beauty of that job was that it meant that I was, in theory, a better administrator the following winter in the office. And in those days, we employed between 8 and 14 mountaineers every year to support science. And we gave those people, and it was an unwritten rule, that they could go out and climb mountains because it didn't get dark, of course. So as long as they're back at work by 8 o'clock the next morning, and that gave them the confidence in a new environment as well. And I think the New Zealand safety record in Antarctica speaks well for that policy. So I've had 32 summers in Antarctica, and I went freelance in 1983 as a photographer, and we ran a photo library supplying photographs to publishers all over the world, based in Christchurch with several staff representing 200 photographers. Published a number of books, and Erebus is my 13th book, I think, but whatever. I went freelance and started working for a variety of adventure companies, some of them aircraft-based and most of them ship-based. And after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we started working with small Soviet vessels that turned into Russian vessels. It was a memorable occasion, but small passenger ships that took 50 passengers and 20 crew. And it was fantastic working with the Russians in the polar regions. And eventually we started sea kayaking, skin diving, and climbing small mountains as well on the Antarctic Peninsula. And then we started crossing South Georgia on Shackleton's route. So that was terrific, and that went on for 30 odd years. But I eventually decided that I wasn't, guiding is really easy when everything goes right, but it's when things go wrong that you need to have extra skills and extra strength in the tank. And I eventually decided to stop Antarctic tourism. It was starting to accelerate and the ships were getting bigger. The Russian ships had run out of their life and the bigger ships were coming in, and I stepped right out of it. But I just wasn't handling ropes enough, and I decided I couldn't handle crevasse rescue. So, but anyway, I got an invitation that I couldn't turn down from an English mountaineer, Stephen Venables, to go on a yacht, and I'd always wanted to go by yacht to Antarctica. So that was in 2020, and that was a ski expedition on the Antarctic Peninsula with 8 clients, 4 of them Swiss, 4 of them British. But anyway, we just snuck back into Chile as it was shutting down for COVID, and I'm lucky to get back into Christchurch as we shut down. And I thought, well, I actually started a book on Erebus in the early 1980s, shortly after the air crash, but I very quickly pulled out of it because there was a plethora of other books came out specifically on the Air New Zealand crash, and I just pulled right out altogether and went on other expeditions and started into other books. So I thought, when I came back from this yachting expedition, I thought, well, I've got all the material here. I've got interviews with people like Phil Kyle and the Frenchman Harun Taziev that you'll meet. And I thought, well, all the material's there in my personal reference library. Why don't I have a go at it? I'm just amazed that nobody else has picked up the gauntlet, if you like, and there's 180 plus years of human history to do with Erebus. And I thought, well, let's give it a go. And so it's my so-called COVID project, if you like. And it's taken 2 years to write the book, and then another year for Massey University Press to go through the editing and design process. So it's been a great project. So I just make sure I get the right clickers here. So Scott Base, you're familiar with. In fact, this is one of the most recent images that I could find. No smoke coming out of Erebus at the time, but I just thought I'd put it in as the title page of the book because it will be the last view you see of that base. In fact, it has already changed. Last summer, they took down the aircraft hangar that dates back to the 1950s. The first few chapters of the book really orient. It's a book designed for a general reader, so it covers human history and, of course, the modern, right through to the modern science. And everybody asked me, "Oh, is it going to be a book specifically on the air crash?" Well, yes, inescapably there is a chapter on the air crash, but But just to remind you that it very definitely is a very real volcano, with its name dating back to Greek mythology, the son of chaos. So Erebus erupts between once and 5 times every day. And so it's a very active lava lake. So these fumarole towers, there's about 250 of them in the summit caldera of Erebus, and you can see them with the naked eye from Scott Base. They're up to 15, 20 metres high, and they eventually fall over just with gravity as they gradually grow, and it's a hollow chimney releasing gases, of course. But you'll see that the book is dedicated to 3 Wellington fellows, Werner Giggenbach and Ray Dibble, scientists that I work with in the mid-1970s, who are gone now, passionate scientists and worked very, very hard in what is a very difficult environment at a higher altitude than Mount Cook. And Tony Taylor was a psychologist here in Wellington who worked in New Zealand prisons a lot, but he was a major counsellor to the New Zealand Antarctic Research Program, looking after the psychology of the winter cruise, but also, of course, after the air crash, he was a significant counsellor for the staff at Antarctic Division that still had to keep Scott Base running. A difficult time. And Garth Varco, that I worked with for many years, helped to recreate the base from its IGY origins. He was a building and service officer at Antarctic Division. He died in a helicopter crash at the base of Mount Erebus some years ago now. Yep. But as I say, the first few chapters just to orient you to the scale of Ross Island, because it's hard to grasp just how big an island it is. And you can see in the far right of the picture there, just the faint sun glowing on the secondary volcano there of Mount Terror. So the top picture there gives you McMurdo Base on the left-hand side, and Scott Base is on the far right on the little peninsula. And I thought the bottom picture was worth including. I don't like Antarctic photographs with flags in them, but this one was inescapable because it does show the glow from the lava lake under the steam plume there, with winter lights from McMurdo on the left and Scott Base on the right. Aerial photograph on the top does give you a good feel for the scale of Ross Island, with Mount Bird, the dormant volcano, out on the far left. The helicopter there is landed on the summit of Mount Terror, so you're looking across to Erebus in the background there. And I put this one in the book because it shows on the very far right of the picture there, Beaufort Island, which is a very crucial part of the Air New Zealand crash story. So it gives you a feeling for, there's Lewis Bay there, where the aircraft crashed. Antarctica has well over 100 volcanoes, and this chapter outlines the nature of these volcanoes. You're familiar with the Pacific Ring of Fire, where you've got continents subducting underneath each other, causing volcanoes from Kamchatka, Japan, down in through Indonesia, into New Guinea, and into New Zealand. Well, if you keep on going south from there, you come to Antarctica, obviously, and it's a very different sort of scenario there. It's a continent twice the size of Australia, and it's sitting on a continental plate which is twice as big again. But it's like the East African rift system. Antarctica is tearing itself apart, and it's down this rift, West Antarctic rift system it's called, with its weakness, where lava is forced up to the surface. So quite a number of the volcanoes are subsurface under the Ross Sea, but of course the central island of Ross Island is the prominent Erebus, the most active on the continent. But you keep on going through that rift system down into the West Antarctic ice cap, and you've got major volcanoes there in Marie Birdland, many of which don't actually breach the actual ice cap itself. Just gives you a feel for a US Basler aircraft that is needed for land on skis out in the West Antarctic ice cap under these big volcanoes. So you can see Mount Takahi there on the bottom right. A very, very large volcano just breaching the surface of 2,000 feet of ice. Continue on past West Antarctic ice cap, ice sheet, and you head up into the Antarctic Peninsula, and it's a different set of volcanoes altogether, with small plates that are riding over each other in the South Shetland Islands. So this is one of the most famous volcanoes in Antarctica, is Deception Island or Horseshoe Island, which has been used for many years as a safe anchorage for whaling ships and still science vessels today. But it's erupted very violently, destroying 2 Antarctic bases in the 1960s. And these days, tourists can go there and swim in the hot water. Continue on up past South Georgia around the Scotia Arc. Again, you've got small continental plates riding over each other to create 11 volcanoes, the South Sandwich Islands, which were first discovered by Captain Cook in the 1770s. And he discovered about 7 of them, but the cloud was obviously down very low, and he didn't actually recognize them as volcanoes. But that was as far south as he went on that voyage, and he was plagued by bad weather, big icebergs, and remember, of course, he had no engines on his ships. But 40 or 50 years later, the Russian navigator Bellinghausen came along in better weather, and he named and discovered another 4 of the islands, and he certainly recognized some of the ones that Cook had discovered and recognized them very definitely as active volcanoes. It's very north of the Antarctic Treaty Zone. It's in the 50s latitude, but it's still south of the biological conversion zone. So to me, it's not sub-Antarctic. It's still technically part of Antarctica. So Mount Belinda up there in 2001 started erupting violently and spewed lava down into the ocean, forming new territory, still administered by British Antarctic Survey, and these days, actually, the Falkland Islands government. So there's some Falkland Islands stamps there, but the bottom, where is it? It's the bottom right picture, Mount Saunders. The top one is my own photograph from a helicopter flying around the crater of Mount Saunders. But this bottom photograph was taken by an American photographer just last year on a private mountaineering expedition in association with British Antarctic Survey Science, because the British scientists had looked at Mount Michael a lot, and they figured just maybe there's a lava lake there. There's lava lakes around the world are very, very scarce. There's not very many of them. There's a couple of them in Africa, and there's Mount Erebus, as you know now, but they may well be, and they've pretty well discovered one there. And this article is coming out shortly in National Geographic magazine, so look out for that. So it's pretty exciting what's going on. And continue on from the South Sandwich Islands right across the Indian Ocean. You've got islands like Kerguelen, and a whole host of smaller islands, all of which are volcanoes. And then you come down into the South Indian Ocean to Australia's highest peak, Big Ben on Heard Island, which is just north of the biological convergence zone. So it's sort of hovering there between, but heavily glaciated, as you can see. And there's also a possibility that Big Ben has a lava lake tucked away under Mawson Peak, because it has actually been actively erupting in the last few years, spewing lava down the side. So cast your mind back to 1841. There was a very significant science venture that sent Royal Navy vessels, the Erebus and Terror, down to Hobart, Tasmania, and then further down looking for the South Magnetic Pole. And James Clerk Ross had been to the Arctic with his uncle. He'd sledged with the Inuit to the North Magnetic Pole. He'd learned a lot about sledging, particularly on sea ice. He had 8 winters in the polar regions, and he had 14 or 15 summers in the Arctic, including an attempt on the North Pole with Parry, before he was assigned this project of coming to Hobart and a quest for the South Magnetic Pole. So he had a lot of experience. So this was 60 years before the Shackleton and Scott era, at the turn of the century in the 1900s. So out he came in the Erebus and Terror, and magnetic observations all the way across the Indian Ocean, and then he came across to New Zealand, subantarctic islands as well. And he did what everybody said he could not be done. All the sealers and whalers said, you will not break through the pack ice in the Ross Sea. But he'd super strengthened his ships. He never lost a man to scurvy. But super strong military ships, and used them effectively the first icebreakers. And he did batter his way through. It took him something like 30 odd days to batter through the pack ice and break into what we now call the Ross Sea, of course. But he was desperately disappointed when he discovered the Transantarctic Mountains, many of which he named after prominent members of the Royal Society, etc. But he was desperately disappointed because he could work out from his observations that the South Magnetic Pole was on land in what we call now North Victoria land today. So he sailed on south, hoping to find a way around the mountains to get back to the pole. And he also started looking for an anchorage, because he had the skills to anchor his winter in his ships and sledge to the pole the following year. But he couldn't find anchorages at all. Kept on coming south, and then in January 1841, of course, discovered Erebus and Terror, and Erebus at that stage was in a violent stage of eruption. I like this painting, which I got from the Maritime Museum in Greenwich, because if you look carefully at it in the book, you can still see the pencil marks where the second in command of Terror, John Davis, drew them on the deck of the ship that day as he outlined this painting. But he must have painted, I'm guessing that he painted because of the temperatures, he must have painted it in his cabin that night, or perhaps back when they wintered back in Hobart. But I really love it because you can just see the pencil marks all over the painting. Joseph Hooker was on board, and that's his painting in the bottom left there. And he was proofreading Darwin's Voyage of the Beagle on board. So he was a young naturalist. So it was fascinating to read his journals as I prepared this chapter. But he also, all these scientists did have an artistic background as well. Interestingly, Ross had a daguerreotype camera on board, which was given to him by Herschel, Mount Herschel in North Victoria land. And Herschel was the discoverer of Uranus, and he was an astronomer. He also coined the phrase photography, and he helped develop the early daguerreotype camera. But I'm guessing because of the length of exposures that you need for that sort of a camera, Ross never had the time, or there was too much movement in the ship, whatever. There were no photographs from the expedition. But there's his sketch map from his log, and as he named all the peaks all the way down the Victoria Land coast, including Erebus and Terror and Ross Island. Didn't really recognise it as an island, but he, of course, eventually sailed out and discovered what we now call the Barrier or the Ross Ice Shelf. But you'll see in the very top of the picture the Parry Mountains, and that's named after Parry, who he'd attempted the North Pole with, but that was a mirage. They're not really mountains at all, which was finally disproved by Scott and Shackleton, who went up in a hydrogen balloon on the Discovery expedition. Their early drawings. So the top picture shows you Mount Hallett, Mount Herschel on the far right, and the one on the left shows as a first drawing of Mount Melbourne. And they named it Mount Etna in their log for quite a few days because they thought it was of a similar shape to the volcano in Italy. But then the middle drawings, of course, show you Erebus and Terror and Mount Bird, and then the discovery of the Ross Ice Shelf. So there's James Clerk Ross. He was called the handsomest man in the Royal Navy. Colin Garwood is a friend of mine from Nelson. He's a lovely, lovely painter, and he's done several series of Ross dependency stamps in recent years. And this is his depiction of Shackleton's Nimrod arriving at Cape Royds to set up their base there. So the chapter begins by introducing Shackleton in the 1901 expedition, but of course it focuses on the fact that they did the first ascent with 2 Australian scientists, Edgeworth David, who was the oldest man on the expedition at 50 years old, and a much younger student of his, Douglas Mawson, Mawson. Eventually did the first ascent of Erebus. But the top drawing in this picture is from Louis Benacchi, the Australian physicist who'd wintered at Pipitea on Borchgrevink's expedition. Now, it's interesting that they sailed on down after their winter and they landed on the Ross Ice Shelf with dogs, and they made an attempt to go south on the Ross Ice Shelf. But interestingly, the Norwegians landed on Ross Island. They landed in Lewis Bay at a place called Cape Tennyson. And very luckily they survived, because obviously a big chunk of ice broke off the glacier and the tidal wave swept some of the Norwegians off this plinth of rock that they were on. But it's just interesting that the first landing on Ross Island itself was a year before Scott's 1901 expedition. So the bottom left picture there is an famous Edward Wilson painting from Hut Point, and it's lovely. They're out there on skis and you can see the glow from the lava lake in his painting. And then the next two pictures are a famous picture by Mawson of the other four on the summit after the first ascent, looking down into the crater. And then George Marston was the artist on Shackleton's Nimrod expedition, and that's his depiction there on the right. Of course, they made the famous book you're aware of, the Aurora Australis, a lot of which features Edgeworth David's description on that first ascent of Erebus. And if you haven't read that, I suggest you do. It's a lovely, lovely description. And they certainly got hammered by really high winds and, of course, low temperatures, trying to keep primuses alight, trying to keep hydrated and fed. Very difficult climb, not easy at all. Here they are up on the top left. There is on the top of the mountain, finding some of these fumarole towers, which they liken to a lion lying down. An interesting novel that came out in 1912 of three boys that get stranded in the Ross Sea. Their ship sinks and they have adventures on volcanoes. But curiously, of course, publishers of the day weren't quite sure if there were polar bears in the Antarctic or not. So let's stick a polar bear on the spine of the book. Very common in those days. And some of the Arctic books had penguins on the spine as well. Curious. And of course, remember that Borchgrevink's expedition took the biggest guns they could bring, because they weren't sure what sort of animals they were going to face either. They thought there may well be bears there. But the bottom picture is important, I think, because the three guys, Mackay, Edgeworth David and Mawson, had proved themselves on the first ascent of Erebus, and they were selected by Shackleton to sledge to the South Magnetic Pole, which they did very efficiently across the sea ice and then inland into North Victoria and glaciers. But of course, the magnetic pole's constantly moving, and they were pretty knackered, these boys, for a lot of man-hauling, and they eventually decided that let's actually just sit down and wait for the pole to come to us. That was, as with Edward David's lines in his diary, which I really liked. They'd had enough of this man-hauling bit, because they knew they had to man-haul all the way back again. Well, the second ascent of Erebus was on Scott's Terra Nova expedition, and the chapter ascent, so there's quite a rare auroral picture over the Scott's hut there with Erebus in the background, a modern day picture. But the chapter focuses on Trygve Gran, a young Norwegian who'd inherited quite a lot of money. He built his own ship and he was desperate to sail to the Antarctic. But Nansen came along and convinced him, no, he shouldn't do that. He's too young. He needed to get some experience. So he teamed him up with Captain Scott, who was coming through to test his vehicles in Norway, tracked vehicles. And Gran impressed Scott no end with his skiing ability. And it was Scott had used skis on the 1901 expedition, but they only used one pole, which wasn't very efficient. So Trygve Gran changed all that and started using two poles, of course. So his alpine skills and skiing skills were invaluable to, so he went on the Terra Nova expedition. So, but the chapter also focuses on Raymond Priestley, a scientist, and Frank Debenham, a geographer, also a scientist, and three of his other mates there. So you're aware of the epic winter story that Priestley had, getting stuck in Inexpressible Island, where they'd spend the entire winter in a snow cave. So they eventually survived that winter. They sledged all the way back down to Cape Evans Hut, desperate for food. They spent 3 weeks eating. They knew that Scott was dead. The search parties who'd been out, Trygve Gran had been out on the search parties. They knew that Scott was dead. Anyway, 3 weeks after they got back, they set off myself on the second ascent of Erebus with Trigger Grand, the technical expert. And so it's an interesting story. And Trigger Grand, when he came back from the expedition, climbed Mount Cook. So he certainly was no turkey. He came back and learned to fly under the French aviator Louis Blériot. He bought a plane from him and flew for the Royal Air Force in the First World War. You'll read his biography in the background. It's interesting. But I focus on Priestley and Debenham because here's a picture on the top there of Debenham doing some plane table surveying on the second ascent of Erebus, and he did some very beautiful maps, which were published in 1922-23. And importantly, Debenham and Priestley, they came down from Erebus to Cape Royds. They used some of the letterhead paper that Shackleton left behind it, and they wrote down point by point of what they conceived and what is now the Scott Polar Research Institute in Cambridge, England. So that's an important part of that story. So there's Debenham's plane table surveying of the summit craters of Erebus. The third ascent was in 1959 with John Harrison, Wally Romanes and Alan Beck, who went on to quite an illustrious career as a volcanologist here in New Zealand. John Harrison was a young mountaineer, and they already had done the first ascent of Mount Discovery in 59. When their party to North Victoria Land wasn't successful, they couldn't land on the icebreaker, so they ended up at Scott Base. And so they made the third ascent of Erebus. But I'd seen other black and white images from their arrival back at Scott Base with a sail up mounted on the sledge, because they skied Erebus and sailed the sledge all the way down. But I'd seen they were only black and whites, and I inherited Arnold Heine's Antarctic pictures a few years ago after Arnold passed away, and I whittled it down to 100 important images, and there was one of them in colour, which was so this was taken in 1959, so my very early Kodachrome image. It took, because Wellington is the worst possible environment to store colour slides in terms of fungus and whatnot. It took me days to clean all the fungus off that image to make it workable in the book. John Harrison eventually died on Mount Rolleston in a rescue. He was killed in an avalanche. But he was a lovely pastel painter. He was an artist in Christchurch. And there's some of the early stamps that you'll be familiar with, I'm sure, from the TAE, with Erebus focused on that threepenny stamp. Through the 1960s, focus on people like Bill Lucy, who climbed Erebus twice in 1 year in 1967. And one of those ascents was with Carlo Mori, a famous Italian mountaineer. New Zealand supported 4 Italian expeditions before they signed the Antarctic Treaty and eventually went on to build their own Antarctic base at Terra Nova Bay. So Carlo Mori was part of that group. And of course, as you're well aware, as the 1960s went on, dogs were increasingly left behind and skidoos were taking over. So the top picture there shows a geology party about to head off using skidoos and sledges with the dogs left behind. But so for all those who have lived at Scott Base, Erebus is a constant friend, a familiar sight every day when you get outside the base. But come along the 1970s, and Phil Kyle, as Peter mentioned, had done his PhD in Antarctica, and he decided that really he needed to work. It was just obvious that work needed to be done on an exciting volcano to extend the science that these early boys had done. So in those days, in the very early 70s, the helicopters were not really powerful enough. So it was a very significant logistic problem to get people up there. New Zealand had quite a number of significant evacuations off the summit of Erebus with altitude sickness, because although it's just higher than Mount Cook, because of the flattening of the atmospheres at the polar regions, it's the equivalent altitude of about 16,000 feet. So you fly from 0 at Scott Base to 16,000 feet, and you got altitude sickness problems kicking in straight away. So it didn't take very long after these evacuations that the American pilots said, "This is crazy. You've got to go to an intermediate camp to acclimatise for 3 or 4 days first. The pilots are on oxygen, the payload for the helicopter is reduced, etc." So it was quite a complicated equation to get scientists and support them up on top of Erebus. So this chapter covers the whole of the 1970s. So here's Werner Giggenbach that I mentioned. He was desperate. He was a geochemist, and he was desperate to get close to the lava lake and some of the active fumaroles there to collect gas samples. to analyse the gas coming out of Erebus. And he had collected samples from the outside of the volcano, of course, but they were very quickly contaminated by air and water vapour, and hence his motivation and incredible determination to get close as possible to the lava lake. So you can see titanium rods there sticking out of the back of his rucksack, and there's a belay rope on the left-hand side. 1974, this is 1978, a 1974 expedition was a major expedition involving a lot of French scientists as well that Phil Kyle had invited along, and they used heavy metal winches that the French were familiar with from their work in Middle Africa with Harun Tazieff, but they were just too heavy to manhandle to get into the main crater floor, and just too cold and too stiff to operate. So in 78 we went back to just using conventional nylon ropes, nylon climbing ropes, even though there was an obvious danger of them melting with molten lava flying around the place, which is indeed what happened. So I ended up being well, this just gives a feel for a difficult environment. Here's Harun, it's very hard for me to point. Harun Tazieff there in the black shirt, toast. He was employed by the French government as a troubleshooter around the French territories to make decisions on major volcano eruptions in places like Martinique, whether we evacuate 100,000 people or not if things are going crazy. So we're drinking Martinique rum there in the hut of Erebus, and it was Phil Kyle that convinced National Science Foundation to build that little hut in the background there, and you can already see the stars and stripes getting torn to shreds. So we still lived in polar tents, but in the early 70s it was really hard to melt enough snow to stay hydrated. A lot of the snow is tainted with sulfur and chemicals and whatnot, so it's hard to stay hydrated. You can only work for about a 6-hour day, and it's too exhausting. So a hut changed all that, especially for people like Ray Dibble, who were setting up seismometers around the crater rim to monitor it. And here he is in Scott Base receiving some of those signals from these seismometers. So the hut was a game changer in terms of cooking and easier living and eating and whatnot, but it also kept his batteries warm, because up till then he could only keep the batteries inside those fumaroles and bury them in some of the warm soil. And so it was kind of Mickey Mouse thing for Ray. He worked his butt off, a really dedicated guy that changed a lot of the thinking about what was going on and how this volcano was working. But this is Ray's tent here, and I'm getting sworn at because I'm supposed to be holding the other end of the tent. The tent had blown away. We'd lost sleeping bags and mattresses. So here we are trying to repitch the tent. And that's Ray there in the background. Yeah, good guy. So here's Harun that I've mentioned. He wrote 2 books on Erebus. The bottom left picture shows Rendezvous with the Devil. It was a film that he was nominated for, I think it was an Emmy or an Oscar, I'm not sure, on some of his crazy adventures in African volcanoes. And here he is here in an African volcano, covered and spattered in volcanic lava and whatnot, with a guy called Francois Lagoon, whose nickname was Fan Fan. So you'll meet Fan Fan a little bit later on, but he came to Erebus several times. But Harun was in his late 60s by the time he came to Erebus in 74, and then I dealt with him in 76 and 78. And he was still playing rugby for the Old Boys of France at the time. And I caught up with him one day, limping on the ski slopes going up to the summit. And I said, "What's wrong, Harun? Are you affected by the altitude? Are you getting tired?" He said, "No, I was in the Marquis. I was in the French underground in the Second World War, and we were out shooting rabbits for food, and I stumbled and I shot half my foot off with a shotgun." He was a hard boy, but passionate about his science. He grew up with Jacques Cousteau and the famous French mountaineer Lionel Terray, and they were very... Cousteau and Tazieff were 2 people that were not allowed to be interviewed live on French television because of their anti-nuclear views. So here's me. I was the guinea pig on the left here to test the rope system in 78 with a bunch of mountaineers. There's Phil Kyle here in the white helmet. So after I went down, and I was very happy to, the place is vibrating. There's a strong smell. Although I've got 2,000-degree lava at my front, I've got ice and snow at my back. So it was a incredible contrast of temperatures. The whole place is vibrating, really noisy. You can hardly hear radio transmissions back up to my friends 80 to 90 meters above me. I wish I'd worn crampons. The snow was sufficiently hard, even though I'm close to a lava lake, sufficiently hard, because by then I was trying to do what's called a tension traverse on the ropes to get across to the fumaroles that I knew that Werner wanted to get to. So anyway, I eventually said, enough's enough. Erebus hadn't erupted for 13 or 14 hours at that stage. I thought, pushing my luck, I'm out of here. So the system worked, and it was just a rope system with pulleys, a bit like mountaineers used to winch people out of crevasses on a glacier. Anyway, you've seen the picture of there's Haroon on the left, on the right there, gearing up with these titanium rods to go down. So here's Ray Dibble's picture on the top left there of it erupted, to cut a long story short, while Werner was down in there. And we thought for sure he'd be knocked unconscious at the very least, possibly killed outright. Molten bombs were landing all around us. We're on the main crater floor here. Some of them the size of a Zodiac, the size of this desk or whatever. So here's Werner at the end of the day, looking very disgruntled, sitting on top of a rapidly cooling bomb. And we broke into that 24 hours later. You could still see it glowing bright red. Eventually, Werner started replying to our desperate radio communications, and there's a picture on the top right there of the burnt rope. Some of the lava had landed on the nylon ropes. Fortunately, hadn't burned through, obviously. Some of the lava landed on his woolen trousers, but with his leather gauntlets, he could brush it off, so he wasn't injured at all. And that's as close as anybody has got to those fumaroles. Lighter moments on Erebus. Kathy Cashman was an American scholar who did a master's here at Victoria University, and Harry Keyes, who did his PhD on salts in McMurdo Sound, but a lot of that was involved in Erebus, and he's continued to work on Erebus right through for many years, even though he was working for DOC by that stage. Just lighter moments, heading out onto the outer rims and things, looking south towards Mount Discovery. Kathy there is not really playing a guitar. It was too cold for that, but she'd buried our Christmas dinner in silver foil and newspaper, and we buried it for 3 days inside the hot soil and cooked our Christmas dinner. We don't do that anymore because it is potentially introducing bacteria or whatever to a pristine environment. So the next year, of course, was 79. And so there's my own photograph from the top of Mount Terror. And it just highlights, and I can't even point it out, can I? I'm not sure. No. Anyway, the aircraft really didn't hit Erebus at all. It hit the base of Ross Island. New Zealand had just finished a very, very difficult drilling program in McMurdo Sound that it was underfunded and under-resourced in many ways. And it stretched Scott Base to the limit. And the leader of Scott Base, Mike Preble, was at his wit's end. And 10 days later, of course, the aircraft hit. So it was a hell of a season for everybody running Scott Base, and especially landing on the shoulders of Mike Preble. So he ran a very, very good operation, handling dozens and dozens of people coming south from New Zealand to sort out the issue there. So a top image of our camp that we eventually set up in blowing snow, and on the bottom picture there's body flags being organised. So again, if you look at that top picture, you're looking due north, and there's that Beaufort Island again. So I won't go into the whys and wherefores of the whole crash, but Beaufort Island plays a very large role in the photographs which we eventually picked up from the passengers' cameras. There's one of the aircraft engines on the left there. And eventually the Scott Base guys, Garth Varco, they're holding the memorial cross outside Scott Base. And everybody in McMurdo, the community of 1,000 people or so at McMurdo, and everybody at Scott Base, 100+ people, all had a hand in that cross. Everybody put some varnish or linseed on. I can't remember if it was linseed or varnish, but I think it was linseed because we had linseed for the Nansen sledges. So everybody went through the sledge room and put a coat of oil onto the memorial cross before it was taken up to the crash site, but it eventually blew away. And they've made a smaller metal one now, which is in situ today. I purposely turned all the images in this chapter into black and white for a number of reasons, but I wanted this concluding picture by an Australian artist, Peter Norval, that I found quite by chance, and I dialed him up. He lives on a farm in Australia. He'd been a commercial aircraft pilot for 30 years. He's retired now, but he's a full-time painter, and he followed the crash quite closely, of course. But this is his depiction of the first moment of the aircraft hitting the volcano. So you've got lava lake up on the top of the picture and wheels flying off the aircraft. The lead light window there is from the cathedral in Auckland, and you've got a file of relatives of the deceased filing up the stairway there. The book also covers quite a number of private expeditions that have come to Ross Island, and this most famous one, the Footsteps of Scott expedition in 1985. Primarily, their aim was to ski to the South Pole, which the three of them did. But it's a very long, complicated chapter in terms of the support that they had or didn't have from their own aircraft and their own ship, which eventually sank. But in terms of Erebus, Roger Meir was a professional mountaineer. He'd done some very significant climbs in Alaska and in the Himalayas in Europe. He was part of the ski party. He was the brains behind the expedition, and he soloed Erebus in winter. So here's the Southern Cross, their vessel in Littleton Harbour, setting out in late 1984. And there's Robert Swan up there with Bill Burton, who was the last surviving member at that time of the Terra Nova expedition. He was a stoker, saying farewell to the expedition. And the bottom picture there is Roger Meir. The chapter finishes with the fact that they had to leave their base. They built a base at Cape Evans, very close to the historic hut, as you can see. And then eventually they had to abandon that base after the ship sank. And there's in the bottom right there is the ship sinking near Beaufort Island. Anyway, Greenpeace eventually agreed to, they did have a second winter in the hut, but Greenpeace eventually took over their base and agreed that they would remove it. When Greenpeace, after their 5 winters on Ross Island, they removed everything from their occupation, including the Footsteps of Scott. So here's Roger Meir working out, plotting his route and whatnot to ski to the pole. And so there's a few sidebars in the book, and I mentioned Fanfan before, the French scientist. He came back with a famous French medical doctor, but also adventurer, Jean-Louis Etienne, who'd skied to the North Pole. But he conceived of traversing Antarctica with dogs. So he teamed up with the American Will Steger, and they inherited New Zealand Scott-based dogs as well. And 4 of our dogs crossed the continent, 7,000 kilometres of sledging in 7 months, the 4th crossing of Antarctica. And so Jean-Louis Etienne, he built a $20 million yacht to support this expedition. They used it subsequently for French television to educate children about Antarctica. And it was called Antarctica, the yacht. It was like a battleship. And he sailed it south, eventually from Hobart into the Ross Sea. It was the first sail-powered vessel since James Clark Ross to go south of Cape Hallett. And they landed at Cape Royds, and they had skidoos, and they drove up to the Fang Glacier on Erebus, and their scientists went up there, and they put ropes right across the craters and whatnot, and they rigged up a complicated pulley system, and Fanfan came back and lowered gas sampling bottles into the fumaroles and things. So you read all that on a sidebar. But the yacht is interesting because it eventually was bought by Peter Blake. And of course, as you well know, Peter Blake was murdered on the vessel. And the boat was then eventually bought by another French expedition, and it's now called the Tara. And it was frozen into the Arctic a few years ago and skippered by a Kiwi called Grant Redvers. And they did a Nansen they froze the yacht in and drifted. So it was a science expedition across the Arctic ice on that very same yacht. Fantastic vessel. In 1990, no cruise vessel had been into the Ross Sea twice in one season. So when my Australian friend who had started Quark Expeditions and I were in Hobart after a voyage to Mawson's hut, and we realised that we were going twice into the Ross Sea, and we had a helicopter on board, which we'd used at Mawson's hut. And we thought, we wanted to climb in the dry, well, Mike wanted to climb in the dry valleys, and I wanted to climb Erebus on the first ascent route from Cape Royds. So we thought, we can't climb in the dry valleys without a helicopter. We need a pilot, and we need $60,000 US. So we went down the corridor to a Japanese film crew, and Mitsuaki Iwago is the David Attenborough of Japan. He had his own television program similar to what you've seen of Attenborough's. And we said, look, do you want to get off the ship with us for 3 weeks? We get off on one voyage and we get picked up on the second voyage. And he said, yeah, we need $60,000. So he said, just a minute, I'll phone my producer in Tokyo. And 10 minutes later, we had $60,000. We had a pilot, we had a helicopter, and we got off the ship. We spent the whole voyage south getting all that. We ran around Hobart buying all sorts of gear because the American and New Zealand programs had shut down by that stage. And so there's no chance of rescue. There was no aircraft flying. All the pilots had gone home, etc. So if anything gone wrong, we would have had to winter at Cape Royds. Or if we got stuck in the dry valleys, if the helicopter had flipped over or whatever, we'd have been isolated. We were the only people in the entire Transantarctic Mountains. It was very exciting period, but there was no latitude for error, that's for sure. So here's the Frontier Spirit with a helicopter and a base camp at Cape Royds near Shackleton's Hut. And here we are in the Olympus range, and we changed to the Asgard range later on. So we climbed some easy peaks. And then eventually we climbed Erebus. So you can see the summit hut is still there, of course, but it's the acid in the gases have totally changed the colour from orange and just burnt it off. And I mentioned at this point the difficulty of this environment. That hut is totally blown away. It no longer exists. It was totally destroyed by the wind. And as you see later on, they built a second hut lower down in a safer place. But that hut was totally demolished by the wind. The last two, the couple of chapters, I wanted to do all the modern science from 1980 right through to 2020 in one chapter, and it just got too big. So I eventually broke it down into the biology chapter, the microbiology, inside the fumarole towers and the warm ground, and then the second chapter focuses on the volcanology. So you're looking across McMurdo Sound there, across a sea of cloud, and that's the Royal Society range in the background. There's 4,000-metre summits on the skyline. So there's the lower hut. There's the new hut, which I haven't been to. That was built by National Science Foundation under Phil Kyle's auspices. And as Peter said, Phil Kyle's had 44 expeditions, 44 years he's worked on Erebus. And in 2016, I think was his last year. I don't think he's now got funding for that. But as you can see, it's quite a big, spacious hut and quite luxurious living. It's certainly slightly lower. More powerful helicopters. Here we are bringing in underslinging fuel to keep the hut warm, etc. And here's Harry Keys again on the right-hand side there that you met earlier. So getting inside these fumarole towers, mapping them, extracting bacteria and primitive plants, algae and whatnot from the warm soil. These days, the scientists are suited up in their sterile suits and whatnot. Some of the abseils and lowers into the fumaroles are quite difficult. So these are just escape vents for the gases. And Craig Carey, an American, but he's been living at Waikato University for quite a number of years now. He's been working on sea ice. He's worked on bacteria in the dry valleys. He's worked on Erebus before, but he's going up there this season, and they're going to drill into the walls of some of these fumarole towers. I think this picture. Anyway, they're going to drill into some of these walls to extract layers of bacteria, which essentially have never been looked at before anywhere in the world. Quite unique bacteria that they're discovering. So watch this space from Craig Carey. Here we are. Here's Craig Carey on the bottom right there with a sort of a powered drill in an earlier version, drilling into those fumarole towers. So this chapter 12 focuses on the volcanology and takes you right through the Ray Dibble years of the seismic work, getting more and more sophisticated work and eventually satellite work. NASA did bring Dante, the robot, and tried to control it from Maryland in the United States. It didn't quite work. In fact, the Dante, as you can see, it's a 3-meter long robot with its own independent legs and system that was capable of going down a vertical wall and then eventually taking gas samples, etc. But it didn't work completely. The coaxial cable broke and wasn't a success. NASA said it wasn't a success, and a lot of these scientists that are now working on Erebus, they've gone on to significant careers with NASA, and some of them, Aaron Curtis for one, they're now driving rovers on Mars every day. That's their sort of routine job, driving these remote vehicles on Mars. Pretty exciting. The top guy there in the orange jacket, Clive Oppenheimer, who's English. He's had 13 seasons on Erebus, and He's written several wonderful books on volcanoes all around the world. He's teamed up with a filmmaker, Werner Herzog, and made some terrific documentaries on volcanoes that you can watch on YouTube. Really, really exciting stuff. And here's Aaron Curtis here experimenting with digging machines into the warm soil to run batteries. And they weren't totally successful, but at least they kept a lot of the instruments going. When the solar panels kick out, when the light drops off in the autumn, they need to keep some of the instrumentation going. So these machines kept the batteries. They didn't exactly charge the batteries, but they didn't enable them to run down. So they were able to get results right through the winter. And one of Clive's job was if you can't get into the heart of the volcano because it's too dangerous, then you wait for the volcano to come to you. And as I said, Erebus blows up. So this bottom left picture shows after Clive and Aaron have broken into a bomb on the side of Erebus, and they're measuring various gases and temperatures and whatnot from a molten bomb. Bob Miller was a surveyor, and I have enormous respect for surveying through the 60s and 70s. Surveying's changed significantly now around the world, of course, but a terrible, terrible job. The other people I had enormous respect for were the mechanics at Scott Base, a desperately difficult job with the quality of vehicles that Scott Base had in those days. But anyway, Peter Otway, there in that picture there on the summit of Erebus, came back as an elder statesman, if you like, as a surveyor, of course, with Wally Herbert down the Axel Heiberg Glacier and with dogs and whatnot. But he came back to Erebus for 3 or 4 seasons and did a variety of work up there on surveying. So I worked with quite a number of different lens and survey surveyors in various parts of Ross Dependency, but also on Erebus as well. So, but here's Phil Kyle. Because his birthdays in that summer period, he's had well over 40 birthdays on Erebus. So here he is cutting into a volcano cake. I knew right from the outset that I was going to cover art of Erebus, the art of Erebus, right throughout the book. And you've already seen George Marston and Edward Wilson, a raft of people, Sean Garwood. Right through the book, there's art, but I immediately thought it seems very logical to conclude the book with a specific chapter on art. So I knew Adele Jackson, who's a young English woman who's based at Canterbury University. She was just finishing a PhD on Antarctic art, and I had a beer with her, and I said, Adele, please, would you research and write a chapter specifically on Erebus? So that's what she did, very beautifully, I think, very powerfully. And as an aside, the air crash chapter, I wasn't sure what one person could actually get across, especially 43 years after the crash. So I had a brainwave one night and I thought, I'll dial up 3 other friends, Hugh Logan, Harry Keyes and Rex Hendry, your president. I dialed them up and said, look, can you give me your reflections, your impressions of that recovery operation 43 years ago? So 4 of us contribute to that chapter. I should have mentioned that earlier. But indirectly, Adele, as like wars and various major events anywhere in the world in history, it sparked off creativity and art, and especially poetry. And so Adele is so Adele's chapter is not just painting art; it covers all sorts of art forms, from song and dance and plays and poetry. And so I think her contribution to the air crash chapter, because there was a significant number of poetry books and poems written about the air crash, notably Bill Manhire here in Wellington, of course. Anyway, I feel she's the 5th contributor to that air crash chapter. But for those of you who have read the science fiction book, The Mountains of Madness, which was written by an American science fiction writer in 1936, it starts on Ross Island with 2 ships coming in, and they have aircraft. It's sort of centered around, the 1930s, the Admiral Byrd sort of era. So they had Admiral Byrd type aircraft, but they go into the Transantarctic Mountains and then all hell breaks loose and they discover all sorts of weird science fiction-y type things. But anyway, Erebus is erupting and whatnot. And a Spanish painter who I just found by Googling, this is his vision of the Mountains of Madness. So it's the opening. Each chapter begins with a double-page spread, as you've undoubtedly realized by now. So this is the Spanish painter's version of the Mountains of Madness boys coming in with their ships to Ross Island. Hilarious. This is interesting. This is an English artist, Sally Gould, and it's called a perigon. Now you draw a painting, squiggles on a looks like squiggles to me anyway, on a piece of paper, but you then put a spherical orb on top of it, and you see the reflection. So this is her Erebus is reflected in her perigon view of Erebus. So from modern art like that through to this painting down here by Yasoda, I contracted in the 1980s to do that for me. And you've got famous New Zealand painters like Austin Deans here. But even back in the 1860s, there was various versions of Erebus painted for various Sunday at home type illustrated magazines. Just gives you some idea of the art in Adele's chapter. Here's Griffith Taylor, geologist with Scott. This is his personal bookplate. With Erebus behind there, of course. But and this dark side of the plume is a takeoff, of course, of the Pink Floyd album cover. And this is a painting that was done, and it's still framed in the mess hall at McMurdo. But unfortunately, the publishers wouldn't let me put it in the book because they thought there'd be endless copyright problems or whatever. But I do like it, the dark side of the plume. But interestingly, the top couple, Michael Carroll and Rosalie Lopez, have both worked on Erebus on the top there. And that's their painting of the fumarole towers, but up on Neptune. And because Rosalie's an interesting person, she's discovered more volcanoes in the world, well, not in our world, in extraterrestrial world, on Jupiter and Neptune than anybody on the planet. So she's I don't know, she's called astrophysicist or something, I'm not sure. But anyway, she's combined with Michael Carroll, the artist, to come up with that work. Oh, I really like this. Edward Wilson, of course, painted the famous menu that all of the expedition members signed in 1911 at Cape Evans. And then in 2011, so 100 years later, Julie Ulrich at Scott Base created essentially the same idea with the Winter Over Party signing the menu. So those images are side by side in the book. There's been a number of other books written about Erebus. Thunder of Erebus is sort of a Russian-American war type drama. Kim Stanley Robinson is a well-known science fiction writer who's worked in Antarctica under the National Science Foundation Artists and Writers Grants. And he was interestingly interviewed by Kim Hill just a couple of weeks ago. Some very interesting, really worth dialing up that podcast if you haven't. But anyway, Erebus comes into his story, Antarctica. But the most recent one by an American author, Erebus, an apocalyptic thriller, Stephen Bird, is fascinating because it starts off inside those fumarole towers in Erebus, and the scientists bring down samples of these bacteria and things, the same sort of stuff that Craig Carey is going to bring, and it gets loose at McMurdo, and it causes all sorts of havoc, eventually all around the world. It's quite a gripping story, actually, but it begins on the summit of Erebus. So I really like the painting on the cover, and I dialed him up in the United States because it's been so successful. It's had 4 or 5 different covers, but I said, no, that's the cover I want because you're actually inside those fumarole caves on Erebus. So I eventually tracked that down for the book. And just a reminder that satellite technology has changed everything in terms of some of the work that's going on in volcanoes all over the world. And so has drone technology, of course. But here's just a relatively recent satellite view of Erebus looking vertically down, and just to give you some idea of the lava lake there. Up in the top of the picture is this old caldera rim called the Fang, and that's where we acclimatise. We go up there for 2 or 3 days before we get flown up onto the summit so that we don't get sick. And just a final view there of Scott Base, which is about to rapidly change. That entire base will be demolished, so they say, because the new base will be built on the same footprint, which I find kind of sad in a way, because all the years that I worked at Scott Base, the 10 summers, we had nowhere to assemble field parties equipment except the hangar, which was freezing cold. And now in modern years, they've got the Hillary Field Centre, which is a big box of a place, but it's a wonderful warm environment for scientists to prepare their equipment before they go into the field. And that's going to go as well, which is, I find pretty amazing. But anyway. just a final thank you to the Antarctic Society that were modern publishing, certainly in New Zealand, requires significant injection of money, or the publisher just can't make the financial equation work. So I needed to find $16,000 and more. I had to buy pictures from museums in Scott Polar Research and Greenwich, etc. And that money came from your society, and indeed Antarctica New Zealand, the New Zealand Alpine Club, Federated Mountain Clubs, Caravan Media, a Trans-Antarctic Association, both here in Wellington and in England, and the Bird Memorial Trust here in Wellington. And a big thanks to Peter that helped organise some of the paperwork to do with those grants. So the book would not have been possible without the support of your society. So thank you very much.
It's been a fascinating talk, Colin. I looked up at Erebus in the 1960s when I went down, mainly doing ship stuff there, not working in Antarctica. So it was familiar territory to me, and it was really nice to hear a whole bunch of names of people I knew. I actually came back from there with Carlo Moro on a ship, and at one stage when I worked at GNS, I had the pleasure, or should we say challenge, of ultimately being manager of Werner Gegenbach. So there was some interesting names along the way there. So thank you very much for that. That was really super talk. And thank you to both Jan and Roger from the Holmes Miller side of life. It's great to have you both here as part of your family history for giving us the Holmes Miller's lectures. So I think thank you to everyone for attending, and thank you, Colin, for a stimulating talk. And I'm sure it's going to lead us all off to go and look for the book. So thank you.